Hi guys, my name is Beatrice. If this is your first time watching, I hope you'd like what you see and subscribe for more. Welcome to BEA'S Creations, a place where I create new sewing video every single Wednesday. In today's video, I will be sharing the making of this beautiful dress that I'm wearing. It is a Vogue pattern. When I saw this pattern, I thought it was so cute and perfect for the holiday. The fabric that I used was a poly crepe that I purchased at my local Joann's fabric store. I love this fabric. I love the color and the gold chain. It is perfect for this pattern. If you would like to see how I create this dress, please keep watching and don't forget to subscribe. Comment below, let me know what you think of my videos, and I will see you on the next one. To begin sewing the dress, I fused the interfacing to the long side of each fabric section. Then I pinned each front and back darts like so. I've also done the same for each front lining and back lining section. To stitch each dart, I'm making sure I follow the dart line and be sure to tie the thread at the end. Now, I'm stitching front and back darts of the bodice lining the same way. Next, I'm using a basting stitch to baste the lower edge of the front and back fabric sections, and do the same for the bodice lining. With right side together, I've already pinned the center front seams together and pinned the bodice lining the same way. Now, I'm stitching 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end to the small circle. And that's how that looks. Next, I'm pinning the front bodice to the back bodice at the shoulder seam. Stitch 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. Now I'm stitching the front and the back bodice lining the same way. I went ahead and pinned the front bodice to the back bodice together at the side seams, and I pinned the bodice lining the same way. Now I'm stitching 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm stitching the bodice lining the same way. Next, I've already pinned the lining to the bodice, matching the center seams and the shoulder seams. I pinned at the neck edge. Now I'm stitching 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. I've already trimmed the seam allowance. Next, I'm going to understitch the bodice lining. I'm stitching through the bodice lining and the seam allowance underneath. I'm stitching it very close to the edge. I turn the lining down, and now I'm doing a basting stitch to the armhole edges of the bodice. And that's how that looks. I've also pressed the lower edge of the lining like so. To begin sewing the sleeves, I'm going to gather the upper edge of the sleeves between the small circles. I began to stitch at the small circle using a basting stitch. I'm going to stop stitching where the marking is, making sure I don't backstitch, and cut a long trail of thread at the end. Next, I'm stitching again close to the first stitch on the outside of the seam allowance, and also cut a long trail of thread at the end. Next, I'm pulling on both ends of thread to gather the fabric. With my right hand, I'm grabbing the two ends of thread and gently pull to start gathering the fabric, using my left hand to adjust the gather like so. Next, I've pinned each sleeve at the side seams, stitching 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Then I pressed the lower edges of the sleeves twice to make a double walled hem, which is also the elastic casing for the sleeves. I'm going to stitch very close to the folded edge, leaving 1 inch opening to insert the elastic. I'm using a safety pin to insert the elastic like so. Before cutting the elastic, I'm going to try on the sleeves to make sure that they fit to my liking. Now, I'm stitching that little opening close to the edge. Next, I'm pinning the sleeves into the armhole, matching all markings and placing the large circles at shoulder seams and matching all notches. I'm stitching 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. And that's how that looks. I went ahead and pinned the skirt right front to the skirt left front together at the side seam. I'm stitching 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and that's how that looks. Next, I pinned the skirt back sections together below the large circle, matching all notches and circles. I started stitching below the large circle, 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. Next, I pinned the pocket lining to the front skirt at each side seam. I also pinned the pocket fabric to the back skirt at each side seam. Now I'm stitching 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. I've already pressed the seam allowances toward the pockets, and next I'm going to understitch the pocket lining like so. I went ahead and pinned the skirt front to the skirt back at the side seam, and I pinned each pocket edges at the side seam, matching all the markings and leaving an opening between the large circles. I started stitching at the upper edge of the side seam, back stitch at the beginning, and I stopped stitching at the big circle, back stitch at the end. I started stitching again below the big circle, back stitch at the beginning and back stitch at the end. Next, I'm stitching the pocket edges together at the side seams, back stitch at the beginning and at the end. And that's how that looks. I also clipped the back skirt seam allowance below the pockets. After I turned the pockets toward the front along the seam line, I pressed them. Now I'm doing a basting stitch to keep the upper edge in place. I've already stay stitched the upper edge of the skirt. Then I pinned the skirt to the bodice with right side together, matching the center seams and the side seams. I also kept the bodice lining free. Now I'm doing a basting stitch to hold it together with 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Next, I'm using a regular length stitch to stitch the waist seam. Then I'm going to stitch it again very close to the first stitch, about 1/4 of an inch. I trimmed the seam very close to the second stitching. Then I pressed the seam towards the bodice. And that's how that looks. To begin sewing the zipper, I pinned the back of the dress seam allowance like so. Next, I'm doing a basting stitch and stop stitching where the back skirt seams begin. Placing the invisible zipper face down, I'm pinning it to the back seam like so. Making sure that the dress is to the left of me, I'm doing a basting stitch close to the zipper teeth, and I'm doing this for both sides. Next, I'm using a seam ripper to unstitch the basting stitch that I did earlier. And that's how that looks. Open the zipper. I'm going to stitch very close to the zipper teeth. I'm starting with opening the zipper tip with my fingers and stitching very close to the zipper teeth. And I'm going to sew the other side the same way. And that's how that looks, a very clean finish invisible zipper. Next, I'm going to slip stitch the bodice lining to cover the zipper tip. And also slip stitch the lower edge of the bodice lining to cover the waist seam. And that's how that looks. I'm super pleased with the finished look. Now the only thing left to do is to hem the lower edge of the dress, which I will do off camera. And that's how that looks. I'm all done with the dress. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you on my next video.